Welcome to the Pier-Glass Poetry Panels. Today's focus is the prose poem. I'm your host, Stan Galloway, and today's show looks at a form of poetry that has puzzled some and invigorated others by blending characteristic from multiple genres. Thank you for joining in. Let's meet our first poet. Jose Hernandez Diaz is a 2017 NEA Poetry Fellow. He holds degrees in English and creative writing from UC Berkeley and Antioch University, Los Angeles. He's the author of The Fire Eater, 2022, and forthcoming in 2024, Bad Mexican, Bad American. He has published widely in such places as the American Poetry Review, Crazy Horse, and the Yale Review. He edits for Frontier Poetry and teaches creative writing for various organizations, including Beyond Baroque, the Writing Center, Hugo House, and elsewhere. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. So I'm just going to get right into it and start reading some prose poems from some of my collections and some of my newer pieces as well that were written in the last couple of weeks. I'm going to start off with a prose poem called Insomniac Moon, which was published in the Sycamore Review. A man couldn't sleep, so he went outside to shout at the moon. Damn you, moon, you're too bright. I can't sleep with that nonsense of yours. Then the moon responded, well, I'm just doing what I'm meant to do, shining, avoiding complete darkness. Nothing would function without me, said the moon. Well, can you at least move west? I'd like a break, please, said the man who couldn't sleep. I have an idea, said the moon. Cover your head in your pillow and listen to classical music. You'll be asleep in no time. That's actually not a bad idea, said the man excitedly. He ran upstairs into his room and covered himself with his pillow. He played Beethoven's Symphony No. 7. In a matter of minutes, he fell asleep. The moon, too, eventually disappeared. And this next one I'm going to read is called Wolverine on Hollywood Boulevard. Hollywood Boulevard often has characters, Mickey Mouse, Spider-Man, Wolverine, folks that like to dress up in as these characters and take photos with tourists. I wake up at 5 a.m. every day because I want to get ahead in life. I take a shower, 15 minutes. I have breakfast and a coffee. I put on my Wolverine mask and go to Hollywood Boulevard. By the time I get to the tourist section, I'm already in character, both physically and psychologically. I charge $50 per photo to tourists. Everyone loves Wolverine. Spider-Man is a wuss, kind of a wacko if you ask me. I think he's hooked on drugs, if I'm being real. Anyway, I wish him the best. No, I don't perform on the street. I don't dance. I just walk around like a badass. People gravitate toward me. I make a decent, honest living. At the end of the night, around 11 p.m., I drive on the cold freeway, still in uniform, still alive. And this next one I'm going to read is called The Stranger. And it's also in my collection, Bad Mexican, Bad American, and it was published in the Yale Review online. The Stranger. A man came up to me as I was walking home from the pharmacy. Are you Jose Hernandez Diaz? Yes, I said. Who's asking? Do you enjoy sipping tea before bedtime? Well, I do, but what is it to you? I asked. In the 9th grade, did you get cut from the basketball team? I did, in fact, get cut from the team. Do you sometimes wonder what life would have been like had you married Margot Cisneros? Maybe sometimes, yes, I said. Are you afraid of small talk and long walks in the city? I'm just a little introverted, I said. Does the night sky resemble a dragon of your dreams? Yes, thank you for asking, I said. Did you cry when Muncy hit that home run in the World Series? I did cry at that moment, proud of it. Were you born and raised back and forth from LA and Orange County? Story of my life, yes, I said. Does the night sky resemble a dragon of your dreams? Yes, thank you for asking. Yes. And I think I have two or three more. This next one is called Voice, and it was published in Conduit. A man in a Carlos Santana shirt looked for his voice beneath a pile of crisp autumn leaves. Nothing. He looked for his voice at an underground rooster fight. Nothing. The man in the Carlos Santana shirt picked up a bulldog puppy and looked for his voice inside of the dog's mouth. Nothing. Finally, the man in the Carlos Santana shirt saw a used black guitar in a thrift store window. He purchased the guitar with his last few dollars. The man tuned the guitar and began to play a bolero. His voice was there, as it turns out, inside of the guitar sound hole. It had been there all along. This next one is called Quetzalcoatl in the City, and Quetzalcoatl is an Aztec snake god deity, and it was published in the Southern Review. I saw Quetzalcoatl at Panda Express in the city. I assumed he would strictly visit Mexican joints, but I'm sure he just wants variety like anyone else. Quetzalcoatl ordered the Beyond Orange chicken bowl. I had no idea he's a vegetarian. Quetzalcoatl had on an elaborate, colorful headdress and carried a shield and a spear. I felt senselessly underdressed. I was in flip flops and a surfing shirt. I thought about going up and saying hello, but honestly, he was intimidating, Aztec god that he is. After Quetzalcoatl received his order, he tipped the workers, waved goodbye, and flew out of the door. I ended up ordering the regular orange chicken with brown rice and vegetables. I ate there and then drove home at sunset. So this last one I'm gonna read. I wrote on Monday actually, after my Twitter was after I had a false Twitter opened up and I had to sort of dispute that. It's called Kafka Was Being Serious. I woke up and logged onto Twitter to discover someone impersonating me. They said I like to read novels in the bathtub, but I don't have the attention span for that. And besides, I only take showers. They posted things with swagger and confidence instead of second guessing and qualifying every thought like I do. They created another personality for me, one who doesn't feel guilty about going to Starbucks, Amazon, or other corporate chains. A carefree everyman, one could say. When I reported this to Twitter support, they said I was the actual fraud, that my name doesn't match up with my ID card. I told them that's because it's my pen name and my mother's maiden name as well. They told me to take a hike and get a real job because writing is a form of criminality. I now wander the damp streets looking for my past self, the one with 20K followers and a sense of purpose. Follow me, dear friends, beneath the scattered moonlight. I'm craving Starbucks again, but the real me actually feels guilty about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. I look forward to the time where we can talk in a little more depth at what you've presented for us. But for now, let's move to our second presenter for today. Dzvinia Orlowsky is an award-winning poet, translator, and founding editor of Four Way Books. She's also a founding member and writer-in-residence of the Solstice Low Residency MFA program in creative writing, and the founder and director of Night Riffs, a Solstice literary magazine reading and music series. She has won awards for her work in 6 poetry collections published by Carnegie Mellon University Press. She was shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize in Translation and more recently, the Derek Walcott Prize in Poetry. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stan, and thank you, Morgan, and thank you for inviting me to be here, and also Jose and Jeff. It's a pleasure to read with you, so I'm grateful for that. I guess one of the questions that comes up all the time is like, how do you differentiate between a prose poem and flash fiction or short fiction? That's as old as the hills. You know, it's got a beard this long. It's been around, but writers are constantly redefining it, and I'll see my favorite prose poems in microfiction anthologies, and I'll see microfiction pieces, etc. So one definition that was proposed when I was on a panel was by the microfiction folks was that in fiction, something happens. And that differentiated from prose poetry. And I just wanted to say that I wholeheartedly disagree with that, because something always happens in a prose poem. The way that it gets there goes all over the place, and it's kept on the rails because of syntax, imagery, music. But I think we're still struggling with definitions, and I do too in my work. So all the poems that I'm going to read are from my most recent book, actually 2018, Bad Harvest. And I'm going to read two prose poems back to back. Both have to do with my parents, because actually on August 30th, it's, I can't even count the years, it's the anniversary of their passing. They both died on that day, 29 years apart. So I wanted to honor them. And what I'll point out is the first poem very much prose poem has more of a narrative element to it. And then the second one is much more lyric. So I go back and forth between the two. So the first one, Playing Possum. My father carefully rolls his pant leg up, places his leg between two wide boards. He tells my mother to jump hard on it. Crippled, he won't be drafted. They agree. Earlier, he had considered hiding under the living room's wooden floorboards, but that would make him feel less of a man and more like a possum, paralyzed and blind. And weren't they known for their short lives? Hadn't his friend Ihor just the day before avoided enlistment by drinking a vial of his wife's blood, spewing it past his cup of urine? Could he too do it? Drive a truck, heave honey, blow grits, trade his rugged for Ralph, blow on his thumb until he passed out? No, he was no greenhorn looking for blood meal. He had a wife, and they were in this together. She springs from their horse-haired filled couch, eyes closed tight, fingers plugging her ears. She lands with a thump. The leg doesn't break. He rolls away from her, screaming, holds his hand up as if to strike the air. Hysterical, she sobs through his curses. Forgiving her slight body, he slowly closes his hand, lowers it over his heart. My father did, by the way, avoid the draft into the German army at the tail end of World War II, and his friend Ihor certainly avoided, it's a true story, by drinking his wife's blood. So I grew up with a lot of interesting resource material. And then this one is for my mother shortly after she passed. The 40th day. The 40th day called forth a night of a different kind of brilliance, when the moon wrapped everything with light, trumpeting yellow pumpkin blossoms, a water pump with a dropped handle resembling a rusty beard, an old chainsaw depression at the top of a tree stump, things just outside her window that spoke with feeble or hoarse voices. A minute passed, and then another. Old roses open fearless and beautiful on this day of sadness. Since flowers were no longer just flowers, they blurred and stretched into transparent curtains, walking in the breeze of the raised storm window, walking for those of us left behind. A little interjection about prose poetry. Back in 1998, when I was still working as a founding editor of Four Way Books, we had the pleasure of having Stephen Berg, you probably know his work, and he was the founder of American Poetry Review, give us this manuscript. It's called Shaving, which to most people, it was creative nonfiction. It was prose. But on the back jacket, Jory Graham said, in reading Berg, you will be reading the master of the prose poem. So that created a bit of a rift. But the interesting thing for me was that Stephen Berg typed everything. He did not have a computer, and he certainly didn't have a floppy disk back in 1998. So we had no way of transferring it. So I volunteered. I was a fast typist to key in all 51 prose poems, X amount of pages. It took me a really long time, but I certainly got to know word by word that book. And what I took away from was the way that he was able to stretch that limit toward the storytelling and narrative, but yet he had these amazing voicings and this rhythm and this musicality that just kind of detach you from the story enough to just take pleasure in the poetic craft line to line. But he was able to sustain that for 2 or 3 pages. So I felt inspired by that, and that was kind of a turning point for me. So on that note, I'm going to read one of my longer prose poems that employs some humor, although the reality, it has to do with my first failed marriage, wasn't so funny. But in retrospect, hey, I'm no longer there, so it's okay. But this is representative of a prose poem that is maybe a little bit more involved in the storytelling, but still employs humor and hopefully a lot of imagery and musicality. And I was going to time myself. I think I'm okay. It's called Why I Hate Nudist Camps. Wayne had already flung off his t-shirt, pulled off his black khakis to set up our tent. I can work faster if I'm naked, a new weed in the wet and wild. Faster maybe, but not better. He slammed things together, tangled ropes. He was angry because we arrived too late to camp near the others, because our Ford Country Squire was stuck in mud, because I didn't bring the small shovel, because the next morning he knew he'd have to get down on his knees, rake the mud away by hand instead of cannonballing naked off the lake dock. But there we were, in a light rain, surrounded by a scourge of mosquitoes, our pump tents left hip sagging, missing a peg, the zip-on, zip-off flap gone. I wanted to call it a day, a weekend, I'm done, and head back home to our triple-decker on Mission Hill. What's the matter with you? Wayne barked as he sprayed repellent on his skin, careful to avoid his penis. What he meant was, why was I still wearing clothes? Jeans and a hooded sweatshirt, a t-shirt and a pair of sunglasses, even though it was after 5. It wasn't because I imagined a couple of skeeters flying too low, curious about the new sweet sweat scent, or because I had told him Charlie's here and feared that the absence of a tampon string would make me a liar. And certainly not because I'd feel inadequate or self-conscious around the other campers at the get-down, hoe-down, pot-belly split with cesarean scars, squash-shaped sagging breasts swaying joyfully, or that group sporting softies at the Mr. Softy machine. No, I didn't give him that satisfaction. To hell, I thought. The next evening, his chest slicked from dancing, he picked up his wrinkly steamed hot dog on his paper plate, looked out into the mob of flesh, and said, "This is where we belong." I'm serious, he said that. That he's not always going to look this good. Babe, come on, he said, take off your blouse. Just once get out of that busted radio of your mind, always stuck on some high-strung wavelength, the kind that always ruins the party. Busted radio? Okay, I said, slowly pulling off my t-shirt. Just enough skin to call it fixed. He shook his head. You really need to build up your shoulders. Okay, I'm going to read 2 more. And one interesting thing that happens to, I'm sure, a lot of us is like, you write one poem or a story or an image inspires one poem, and then the poem kind of goes, the prose poem goes in 2 ways. And growing up first generation Ukrainian, and that's a subject that I could take on a whole other hour, but I won't. I was just really aware of a lot of things that occurred to my family and as they emigrated and were refugees, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things my mother used to bring up was about how oftentimes people would, to escape, like if there was a mass shooting or something, they'd pretend they were dead and then they would roll to safety. So rolling to safety stayed with me, and I started writing a sequence of prose poems based on that metaphor. Okay, let me just grab it, sorry. This one is called Out of the Woods. Blood throbs against my uncle's eardrums as Nazis prod him with rifle butts. His back grows wooden. When they leave, he opens his eyes. Hell will find him, take a match to his soul, blaze him into a human bonfire. He works his swollen tongue into an oasis of melted snow, praying for rain. Saved from the dead gray mold of shallow graves, he turns over, lips quivering, no soldiers emerging from the woods. Someone is watching over me, each word a rosary bead falling from his mouth. Above him, the blanched sky, but nowhere to be seen, the silver branches of the watchful tree. And I'll close with this really short one, and it is called Rolling. Late August, a black cat rolling in mown grass flips to its back again, then rolls to its feet, half sun-drunk, half whiplash tail. I am loved, not am. I've mastered these tricks. At parties after my husband's break a leg, rolling an ice cube on my tongue, my eyes rolling over crowded rooms, my body buckled forward, rolling over rolling words, rolling my eyes, having blood drawn, the vial filling slowly as floodwater rising, rolling through one marriage, then breaking it off, holding up, each of us rolling away into our second marriages, pretending, yes, to be dead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dzvinia. That was a delightful and various course that you took us on.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Our third presenter today is Jeff Friedman, whose 10th book, Ashes in Paradise, will be published by Mad Hat Press in spring of 2023. Friedman's poems, mini stories, and translations have appeared in such places as American Poetry Review, American Journal of Poetry, and The New Republic. One anthology title that I love that includes Friedman's work is Cast Iron Aeroplanes That Can Actually Fly, Commentaries from 80 American Poets on Their Prose Poetry. He has received an NEA Literature Translation Fellowship and numerous other awards. Thank you in joining us today.
Thank you, Stan. It's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me for the introduction. And it's wonderful to meet all, I know Dzvinia from a long time, from before childhood, actually, before birth. Jose, I'm just meeting today, which is great. And Stan, I'm just meeting you today, and Morgan as well. So that's all really very pleasant. I'm going to start out and read a poem from my book, Floating Tales, which was published by Plume Editions, Mad Hat Press, 2017. And the poem is called Judges. And let's hope it's here. Oh, it's still here. Good. So let me see. There's a couple of references that I should make known. People like Moses and Joshua, they'll probably be obvious, but a mezuzah is something that's on the doorposts of Jewish houses, and there's usually a piece of Torah inside of it, and it represents sort of harmony in the household. And it's said that if there's something wrong in the household, there's something wrong with the piece of Torah inside of it. So anyway, this is called Judges. I'll read the poem. After the guest ate all the potatoes and the whole brisket, after he ate the simmus, the roasted beets, and the fruit cocktail, he called for Elijah to enter the door, for Elisha to send a hatchet on the water, for Joshua to blow his trumpet. He called for Moses to drum up more business in this poor economy. He touched his Star of David. He touched the mezuzah on the door. Something's wrong, he said. This house has lost its harmony. What can we do, we asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he ate the chickpeas, the hummus, and the leavened and unleavened bread. He ate the honey cake and the prune pudding. What else could we feed him? Would he fix the piece of Torah nailed to our doorway? Would he bring peace? Would he boil the pots and pans and say a prayer? Would he rock back and forth in his white shawl? Next, he ate the porcelain bowls, plates, and all the silverware, then the glasses and tablecloth. He ate the chairs and the dinner table. and then the couch and coffee table. He ate our phones so we couldn't call for help. He ate the dust, the particles of debris and shed skin, the shadows with their long threats, the voices rising from the floorboards, the blessings that failed to bless. When he finished, when the place was empty, he looked us over, flashing his teeth. As we backed away from him, he belched loudly, said a prayer. That should take care of the problem, he announced. Now there was nothing left to fight over, but nothing was more than enough. That actually happened. Our friend came over and ate the whole house. His name was Ross Gay. He ate everything in here. I would like to say, I guess I'll say a little bit about my background and the prose poem and the micro, because when I was pretty young, influenced by fairy tales and fables, I used to write story poems about a half page to a page. Then as time went on, I stopped writing those and became a writer of poetic verse and was even introduced many times as a poet, which I'm not sure how people responded to. My husband, here's a poet. He's a poet, that kind of like, that's his job in life, to just be a poet. For the most part, I wrote lyricized poetry that often involved a storyline or a story fragment to create an emotion or spirit. I also wrote poems that were ritualistic, influenced by biblical prose or verse, however you choose to call it. And I guess that would be, the one I just read would be an example of that, very insistent rhythms. Then one day, out of the sort of the clear blue, I found myself writing my way out of verse into prose poetry and microfiction. I'm not sure why. I mean, it just sort of happened. But everything I wrote came out as in a paragraph. The prose poems and the micros allowed me to get more voices and more tonalities in my work, more kinds of humor as well. Often I'm writing fables or mini tales with surrealistic images. So in a way, my work has come full circle back to the kind of story poem that I first envisioned, or I first started working with. The next piece I'm going to read is called What Happened to the Country, which is really kind of a good question. It's one of many poems I've written in response to the incredibly inept and incredibly cruel Trump dictatorship. Okay, what happened to the country? Some say the president declared the country his and took it home. Some say the country was wild turkeys waddling under the blind blue sky, deer leaping into the foliage, but hunters dispatched them into the next world. Some say that even though hundreds of trucks cranked their winches, the country sank into the quagmire and pulled the trucks down with it, bubbles bursting on the surface. Some say you can still find the country if you have the right map, but so many have followed their maps, disappearing without leaving behind a note or a sign. Though many remember the country with tears in their eyes, and many salute when they hear it called by name, though some decry the country as a false brotherhood. Others believe it was an idea, and ideas evolve into other ideas or evaporate like rain beaded on window frames whose glass has been shattered. Without a country, without a piece of land, there is nothing to fight over. And now all of us are refugees, walking in twos or threes toward nowhere anyone can imagine. Some of these, I'm going to start reading some new pieces here, or some semi-new, maybe even totally new. The next piece I'm going to read is called Lost Memory. And I think Dzvinia mentioned something about micro stories and prose poems and being interchangeably. Lost Memory was originally published as a prose poem in New World Writing, but then later selected for Best Microfiction in 2021. So who was I to argue with that? So I went with it, and it's triggered by kind of a weird little story. When I was like 6 years old, not to get into childhood, but when I was 6 years old, I had double pneumonia and I missed almost the entire year of school. And my mother had all the children over from the school for, just baked goods. And we lived in an apartment and they stuffed into my closet-like room. And anyway, I was talking to my sister and I told her this story. And then 2 months later, she told me almost the identical story that she had double pneumonia, and our mother had the kids over. And I was like, we got into an immediate fight about whose memory this actually was. I believe it's called important memory. But anyway, this piece is somewhat, well, it's totally about it in its own way, but it's a little removed from that. My sister stole a memory of mine from my house and took it home, hidden in her coat. I couldn't remember the memory, but there was an empty space on the sideboard under the window. Give me back the memory, I said, standing outside her door, and I won't report you to the authorities. She let me in. Don't be ridiculous, she said. Why would I steal a memory of yours? It didn't take me long to find the memory, a blue jar sitting on the glass stand between two chairs. When I picked it up, she looked puzzled. This is my place, she said. These are my things. Not true, I replied, and unscrewed the lid. Emptiness wafted out with its stinging scent. Now I remembered something I had wanted to forget. I screwed the lid back on quickly and set it down. That's my memory, she said. You shouldn't have opened it. Then what do you remember, I asked. Nothing. It's gone because you let it out. And as I stood there, angry at my sister, the scent of the memory evaporated, and all I could remember was the jar, and now that belonged to her. I think that's called importing a memory. And you can import a lot of things, including memories, apparently. Just watch any Philip K. Dick movie made from one of his books. I want to say a few things and address a couple of. For me and many other writers, there's a gray area or a fuzzy border, or perhaps no border at all, between the prose poem and the microstory. When I sit down to write, I write what follows without thinking about what it is. Over the years, dialogue has become a larger part of my work. I used to think my poems began in sound or image and my stories with dialogue. But that's not really true, because many of my poems do begin with dialogue and many of my micros begin with an image. The prose poems and micros are in conversation. Each informs the other. In the back of my mind, I do think that I may still in theory, if not in practice, hold on to the idea of the poem having a rhythmic intensity. And maybe somewhere I still think of it, but I don't know that I really believe it. But in truth, for me, the two genres are fueling each other. And I have to say, I've been asked to judge flash fiction slams, and almost always the true fiction writers almost always come in with something has to happen or something like that, or it has to have more of a story. And I'm like, well, I then cite thousands of examples where pieces work in different ways, but they don't buy into that. So there is, I think an interesting point is that maybe with all the, I believe Dzvinia brought up the idea about that discussion between the prose poem and the microstory. And I'm not sure it's as old as this discussion is between the poem and the prose poem, but the poem and the microstory, there may be, like, if one were to draw a Venn diagram between prose poem and microstory, one might find out that there's a new kind of piece existing in that borderline now that we should be talking about in a way. I think actually, Lydia Davis in one of her interviews has talked about the idea that there are some writers who actually are kind of writing a different kind of piece, but we just don't have a name for it yet. It's kind of working in both ways, but working between them also. Okay, so I'm going to read Giver of Gifts, which is another, I'm ashamed to admit, it appeared in both a microstory and as a prose poem. So it's got double identities, but during the pandemic, we were all wearing masks, and my piece was wearing a mask one day, and then it took it off another day. So Giver of Gifts. This is dedicated to some of my teachers from childhood, some of the rabbis, and some of my poetry teachers who were, I would say, brilliant, but also crazy. So dedicated to them, or it's about them in a way, composite, I guess. Giver of Gifts. Before the old man went under, he sang one of his miserable songs for which he is famous. He praised onions for their character, ducks for their communal spirit, and the carpenter ants for their strong jaws and endurance. So what if they don't win any races? He kissed each of us on the cheek for the last time, he said, his breath stinking of horseradish and garlic. Be kind, he said, which he never was. He praised chicken fat, the four bellies of the cow, the croaking frogs that scared the shit out of Pharaoh with whom he split lox and bagel at the Carnegie Deli on Wednesdays. He cursed the evil, demented president and all his sycophants. He cursed the Confederate senator blocking every bill, his waddle trembling, the attorney general bloating like a stuffed turkey. He begged us to follow the righteous path and give up vanity. He asked that we light candles for him, repeat his words, tell stories of his life. He asked that his memories become seeds that we plant in the wind. He called himself the last Babylonian king, spreading literacy to the masses. He called himself a giver of gifts, though he never donated to any causes or even dropped a nickel in a beggar's cup. He praised himself for his journey in the desert, his days running with the hyenas, his devotion to a small bird that died in his hands. Then he closed his eyes and went under. At last, there was no pulse or breath, no preaching, only peace. But in the morning, he began to sing another of his miserable songs. And before he went under again, we had to repeat the whole damn ceremony. Let's see, do I have some time here? Okay, well, I guess I'll read one more piece. It's a lighter piece called My Sister's Gift. Not the same sister I just read one. This is a fictionalized sister, I think. Or maybe, but anyway, My Sister's Gift. We're in the living room when my sister coughs up another fish. Get that fish, my mother orders and throws it in the icebox. The fish flips and flops and slips out of my grasp, but eventually I trap it with a small metal wastebasket. I dump the fish in the freezer with the other fish my sister has coughed up. In the living room, my mother is reading the same book she is always reading, and my sister lies on the couch, perhaps fatigued from letting out another fish. What's the matter with her, I asked. Nothing, my mother answers. She just occasionally coughs up a fish. My sister pops up with a pillow in her hand. My mother says I'm gifted. She giggles, proud of herself. Don't you think we should do something about this? I asked my mother. She inserts her bookmark and places the book on the stand and then removes her black cat-eye glasses. Why, she says, the fish are pretty good, dinner-sized and tasty. Your sister is saving us money on our grocery bill with her gift. What if she coughs up a fish at school, I ask? Everyone will ridicule her mercilessly. My sister punches me on the arm softly. No, they won't. You should see some of the things they cough up. My mother tells me to mind my own business and that it wouldn't hurt me to contribute something to the family budget. Then I feel a tickling in my throat and a cough trying to leap out. So I keep my mouth shut for the rest of the morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so very much. And this, I think, is an excellent time for us to log out and come back in on the second link that Morgan sent to us.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so very much, all three of you, for your poetry, for your thoughts about the poetry. And now I'd like to take us into a discussion of some of the things that we've heard from each other, maybe some new insight into craft or into subject matter that might be not only instructive but entertaining as well. And one of the things that I notice across all three of you is you probably all heard the dictum when you were learning to write what you know, how that each of you create out of your personal experience. And I wonder if you would like to address that either from a positive or from a counter argument to that.
Well, okay, I'll start it out. I mean, I think that I went down a road where I was writing about my family and about work and political issues a lot from the personal perspective. And as I got further and further along, I began to move further away from the personal I and more into a kind of fictional I, and also fictionalizing, really involved with a kind of fabulism, but fabulism that might be more, I guess you could say, that was based in more psychological realism. So some people might call that magic realism. I don't know that I want to call it either of those, but I did move away from having an eye that was Jeff Friedman, that lives at a certain place and does that. So, and I noticed others had their own approach to that.
Yeah, I had a similar experience where initially I started writing a lot of poems about my real life, social realism, about growing up first gen, low income in Southern California as a Mexican American. And so this was linear verse and, like I said, mostly true to my life. And then I started moving away towards, I read James Tate, and I was influenced by Tate and a lot of the surrealists, and I didn't even think that you could write in the third person in poetry. So I was fascinated by that, and I started exploring, this other surreal realm, and just having fun with it, and trying to make it interesting as well. And then I said, well, I could also incorporate, some imagery from my real life or from my culture as well. And I started writing prose poems like El Sombrero, where I'm sort of floating along the coast in a giant sombrero that saves me, and then ultimately it is ruined by the water, and sort of shows how my parents sacrificed and my culture was sort of sacrificed for me to be here in America, and etc. So initially I started personal, then went to third person, and then sort of mixed it. And I guess that's where I'm at more nowadays, is sort of mixing it. But I tend to jump around from different aesthetics and perspectives.
I basically, I think when I first started writing, I wanted my mysteries to be all, equal to like Simon and Garfunkel lyrics, those kind of mysteries. And being first generation Ukrainian American, they didn't quite match up. And I think that once I really realized that I have the freedom to write what I know, I realized that I've been given the freedom to write what I don't know, and to make that very personal. My experience, I mention often that I was raised in a minor key, because I was aware of a lot of sorrow coming from my grandparents, and then kind of a rebellion. My parents were very youthful, and they wanted to have parties, and but as a child, I didn't really understand what I was picking up on. So my first chapbook was called Burying Dolls, because my way of playing was to do these masses for my stuffed animals. And I buried all my Barbie dolls right below my window, because I was hearing these things about people left unburied. And it wasn't until, I was already a young adult when we sold our house in Ohio, and somebody called up and they said, we're putting down a garden and we're digging up all these Barbie dolls. Somebody who want them? And it's like, no. So there was plenty of mystery and plenty of sorrow that I think I've been exploring throughout my books, with the exception, detour, of a couple of them. And even I have to say, in writing Bad Harvest, I was touching on the Stalinist Holodomor, the terror famine, and teaching it at Providence College, and all the students never heard of Ukraine. And so there's this big, big epic narrative involving a country that many people didn't even know existed. And the language has shifted so many times that it's like, I'm fluent in, what am I fluent in? So a lot of things, not to bring up the war that started in February, but it's taken me like a lifetime for almost that subject matter to catch up. And now I'm beginning to piece it together. So it's kind of been like one long poem. So I encourage anybody to write their truth, even if they're clueless, even more so why those feel like truths, or why they are.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think to some extent, I'm listening to what Jose said, but everybody sort of, maybe the Emily Dickinson statement, tell the truth, but tell it slant, is what we all begin to kind of arrive at some point, because I think there's some, well, how do you tell the truth? And then you start telling it a certain way, and then it no longer seems like to get at the real thing. So, or to get at, or that it becomes something that is changed in your past, and you have to find a new way of looking at it. I keep thinking of Philip Levine, for example, who wrote about those same factories and roads over and over again, but at every stage of his life, he seemed to find a different distance to approach the subject.
I was also going to say that sometimes, I'm sort of conflicted about, aesthetics and inspirations and the Neruda quote that says, there are no volcanoes, and come and see the blood in the streets, come and see the blood in the streets, come and see the blood in the streets. So sometimes it's like you want to write about these fantasies and other worlds, and then, the real world smacks you in the face, and a white lady comes up to me and tells me, "Where's the trash?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she thinks I'm a janitor, because I'm Mexican. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, like, I want to get surreal and abstract and absurdist, and then the socially conscious aspect of my existence is sort of undeniable. And my friend ODs on fentanyl, so a lot of times, just growing up low income, Mexican American, first generation, it's sometimes hard to just have art for art's sake. There's a bit of a balance and an imbalance, I would say. So
Stan, I don't mean to interrupt if you were going to comment, but I did have a question for Jose and Jeff as well. First generation wise, how are you fluent? I mean, were there two languages in your home, or was there like this eagerness to speak English, to become an American? And did that come into your psyche?
It's tough to say because, my older siblings, I come from a family of 6, and my first 3 older siblings, they speak fluent Spanish, English as well. But the 3 younger ones, since we had older siblings that were helping take care of us, we tend to speak more English, sort of broken Spanish.
Yes.
And also growing up in Northern Orange County, where I was initially raised, which is sort of a middle-class, Midwestern-like neighborhood in the middle of Southern California. But we grew up in, low-rent apartments with like 8 folks in a 2-bedroom. So it was kind of like living in different worlds at the same time, and different, both economically, and sometimes you'd be around, wealthy people. Sometimes you'd be, in South LA. And so it was just like various sort of different things going on. But yeah, with the language, my Spanish, I'm working on it now because I'm more conscious of it. But initially I was just mostly speaking English, and my Spanish was serviceable, but probably broken.
Yeah.
So I think we had a different experience because I was growing up not that far out of the Holocaust. And matter of fact, I didn't know my grandparents. They died, but they didn't die in the Holocaust, but their brothers and sisters did. And they were over there. And my mother really was conscious. She didn't speak Yiddish. I mean, I knew a little from listening to words around the community of that, but she was very careful about wanting us to assimilate as much as possible. I mean, she was she had me, she was in her 40s when she had me. My 2 older sisters are much older than I am. And so there was a little gap for me in between the age of my parents and the other parents. So I was conscious of growing up, that whole thing. They just, like my father would say, I want you to get good marks. And I go, what's a mark? And that kind of thing. But there was a real consciousness of not being sort of old country-ish by my parents. And my dad particularly, he did, he kind of fed into that too, but he grew up in a whole different circumstance and left home very young. So, so that kind of, I mean, I think that kind of answer. It plays a part in mine because I didn't know very much about my family members my grandparents and the old, and so when I was writing about them, especially when I was younger, it was a mystery, and I was kind of inventing the life for them, you know. So I wrote a number of poems that tried to make up something in Galicia, which was part of the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I was constantly writing poems about that, you know, early on. I mean, I suppose I still write them, but from a different angle.
It's interesting because, like, we were talking earlier about, like, you know, the first person versus writing in the third person. And I think those situations when there's you know, a couple of cultures and different languages in the household, there's this simultaneous development of the I and then the other, and I and the other becomes one and the same, because you're always aware of being slightly alien, or the concerns that you have nobody else seems to have. So I think it's an interesting question to see, like, if you see yourself as alien or the other, how, you know, do you embrace that, or how you cut corners to kind of get into the more general mainstream of poetry or flash fiction or prose poetry that you admire. I mean, I know I struggled it, for example. I mean, this is, you know, the word tabir, means camp. And my parents used to always send my sister and I to Tabir, to Ukrainian camp in the summer. And I hated it. I'd get homesick and cry every night into the crying frying pan. There was a special frying pan put aside for people to cry into. But Tabir also means concentration camp. And I remember in elementary school, we had to write the quintessential, what did you do over the summer? And I wrote, my parents sent me to a concentration camp. And I remember the teacher, I'll talk to you after. She contacted my parents. So there was a lot of figuring out with language. Anyway, that led to irreverence, I guess, and life-saving humor, hopefully.
Did they feed you in the concentration camp?
Yes, they did. Very strong coffee in the morning and some kind of slop. We got the same slop every day until the parents visited. Then I think they gave us hot dogs or something.
Earlier, Dzvinia, you said something about writing what you know and writing what you don't know, and how that sometimes you have to write what you don't know in order to know what you know, if all of that didn't get tangled up in saying it. And I just wonder if any of you could remember in writing when you learned something about yourself that you didn't know before you started writing it.
Learn something about yourself?
Yeah. Or, yeah, I mean, you start writing and you recognize, oh, that's what I've not been able to articulate all this time.
Probably.
Yeah.
I think, go ahead, Jose, you first.
Oh yeah, I think we were talking about this sense of feeling othered or alienated, and oftentimes I would write about not feeling, you know, American enough, but at the same time not feeling Mexican enough.
Yes.
You know, over here you're too dark, and you know, you didn't grow up with privilege, and over there you're whitewashed and you're trying to be American, and then I think this is the rapper Earl Sweatshirt from Odd Future that says, you're too white for the black kids, and you're too black for the white kids. And for me, it was the same thing, but too Mexican for American folks and too American for Mexican folks. So you sort of become this like new identity of, you know, Mexican American, Chicano, call it what you want. Pocho, I relate to a lot of that. The Pocho is a little bit more assimilated. They probably don't speak English. The first generation probably has more ties to the roots through the parents, and then the immigrant obviously experience. So there's just different layers, and just making sense of all that. And I have a poem called Enough, in which you were asking if I discovered something, and that's what I sort of discovered, was that you kind of won't fit in perfectly into any little box. So just, you know, I became my sort of my own role model and my own you know, sort of inspiration through poetry, and finding my voice through that, I think. So I sort of identify more just as a writer, poet, editor, and all these other things are sort of hard to fit into, and not absolutely necessary to fit into all the time.
Yeah, it's funny how much we all seem to have in common that way, feeling in and out. Dzvinia, you were going to speak. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no. Absolutely. No, I was going to say that I don't know that I've ever had the aha moment in a poem, but I usually have it by the end of a manuscript. And that happens kind of at the very, very last minute, because the manuscript is essentially one long poem. But I've lost my train of thought. We'll leave it at that. Yeah, I don't have those kind of aha moments really frequently. It takes it a while.
Yeah, I think I found out stuff that what'd you say? I'm sorry. Did you finally remember?
Oh. I just remembered. I'm sorry, and it's not.
I can't remember what I was going to say now.
I can't remember what you were going to say, right? No, but I was saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, what I learned coming out of Bad Harvest was that it takes a village of voices to create your own voice. And I've had people say, "Oh, you write these lovely lyric things, but then you're irreverent, funny. You should really, somebody was hoping to be like my marketing person. They said, you really should find one lane and pick that and stay with it." And I couldn't. It's like one voice contradicts the other. And that's been my life. And that's who I am. Take it or leave it. So I think I gave myself the freedom to absolutely sound like 5 different people, because in some sense I am. The voice that I'm talking right now is not the voice that I'm going to say, "Jay, I'm done. When do we eat?" Not the voice that I talk to myself at 2 a.m. in the morning. All these voices are legit. And I think, because your subject matter doesn't change, but it's like the lens keeps shifting. So I think that was a big discovery for me. Anyway, sorry, back to Jeff.
Oh, I forgot what I was going to say. I'll have to make something else up
for you.
I'll have to make something else up. Okay. Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think I found out a lot at different times writing. I've had those kind of moments. I relate pretty much to what Jose is saying, because when I was growing up, I was in an area where there was my parents moved into this area, into the apartments. It was a wealthier area, the school district, and but there was a lot of anti-Semitism. So I can remember sort of keeping lists of Jewish actors, Jewish writers, Jewish who had sort of made it, and keeping that in my mind, because there was constant slurs every time about Jews that I would hear. And early on, I mean, like I said, I remember discovering, I grew up in St. Louis, although I was born in Chicago, and my father's from New York. But T.S. Eliot it took a while to figure out T.S. Eliot was actually from St. Louis, and his family had founded one of the founders of Washington University. But he was so anti-Semitic. I remember reading Proofrock and thinking, what a great poem. And then all of a sudden I had this thing where I had to just get away from this idea of, that thought that here's this guy who was going around preaching about culture and the Jews and culture at the time that Hitler was rising. So, everybody's always talking about the man or the art. In other words, somehow the art is greater than the man, and that's probably true. But if somebody's torturing you or tormenting you in some way, it's really hard to think about it that way. So, finding an identity, and that identity became many identities, because I'm constantly switching myself. So I can relate to what Dzvinia is saying about that. And my students would probably tell you that I change moods 60 times in 40 seconds. So anyway, I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. I was thinking another angle on this question. It goes back to the very first poem that we started with, or Jose writing about, wasn't his very first poem, but writing about his Twitter identity and having to decide, is this me? Is this not me? And it's in your face when somebody takes that from you and puts it out there. Yeah. And so I really appreciated that poem, Jose, where you're saying, but that voice is confident and I am not. And, this one does this. And I thought that was an excellent more than an exercise, but it certainly was an instructive way to think about who am I as a poet? Who am I as a presence? Who am I as a tweeter? Who am I as a teacher? And as Dzvinia says, I'm 5 different people, or Jeff, I'm 60 different people, in the space of a minute. And yet those poems have to lock onto something.
Yeah.
And I think that's the sense that Dzvinia was getting at just a second ago when she said, I can't pick one lane. Different voices speak at different times. And one of those, to change that just a little bit, one of those who am I questions also comes down to the poet as what form will I use when I write? And we're looking at the prose poem, and I know several of you, if not all of you, have also written lineated poems, maybe even rhyming poems. And so I wonder if you can kind of look at the different identity, either that you have as a poet or that the poem has, because it is in the shape of a prose poem.
Yeah, after so many years of writing lineated poetry, I think, it's funny, sometimes a form chooses you, and I like once I started writing prose poems, I haven't really, over X number of years, I haven't really been able to, I've probably written 1 or 2 pieces and lines in the last, I don't know how many years. So I don't know that, my identity is now like between the micro, somewhere between hybrid micro prose poem and I don't necessarily identify with it. I kept seeing to myself that every once in a while I say to myself, well, I'm going to sit down and write a poem in lines, and I just don't do it, So I guess I've become attached to this idea, or just it's coming out that way. So, but again, I've changed quite a bit from if I look back at where I used to write and how I'm writing and the kinds of things I write now and the way I look at things have changed. And I'm sure that's true of both Dzvinia and Jose, that your ways of looking at things change quite a bit. And some extent, the form defines you a little bit, rather than you defining the form somewhat. So, I mean, it's a give and take, I think. You bring what you have to it, but it also brings what it has to you. And that's what, that's the match up there. That's the grip that goes on. So I probably hedged your question so I could pass it on to somebody else. But I figured if I talk long enough, everybody would forget what the question was. I know Dzvinia did.
Did I can answer?
Oh, a memory like a...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
All right. Stop lighting up, Jeff. I see your blue thing. Oh, Jose, did you want to say something? I don't mean...
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, for me, the difference is if I have this, to what extent that I'm still willing to reflect and allow silence into the conversation that becomes the poem. So when I want to tell a story, it's usually like, hey, you wouldn't believe what my father did to avoid the draft. He actually friggin' tried to have my mother jump and break. That's not interruptible. I can't wait to share that story. The poem, The 40th Day, it was all about the movement, my mother passing this static book flowers, and then just shifting my attention to this curtain that was billowing, that began walking, that I then imagine it was allowing her to walk for us left behind, who are in the static mode in mourning. And the same thing with rolling. That poem had to keep rolling. I did not want to interrupt it. But other poems that I write, I'm an image hound, and I love couplets. And I love couplets because they do allow for that silence. So it's like I have this poem written to my father called The Last Goodbye, when I held him when he literally took his last breath. And I needed to stop after one image and let silence kind of move in and then continue. It wasn't like, hey, you wouldn't believe it was really awful being with my father, when he, so I think, again, silence has that's the other non-written but written component that dictates for me whether something's going to go prose poem or verse.
Yeah, I think for me, it just varies on the poem, on the line that comes to me, on the experience. for example, I have a poem called "My Father Never Ate Until All of Us Had Eaten," which is about him, growing up, not sitting at the table with us and just sort of letting us eat as much as we wanted till we were full, and then he would just eat whatever was left over. And so a poem like that, I think the directness of it speaks enough on its own that it doesn't need to be an elaborate metaphor or written in persona. And then there are other things like I remember one time I was asking again to talk about my parents, but I was asking my mother if she thought I would make it as a writer, and she said no, like straight up, like my parents are my mom's kind of cutthroat. She literally grew up on a ranch, like tearing the heads off of chickens, So her son comes in talking about poetry. It's like, that's not very masculine. That's not very macho. Go be a butcher. You know what I mean? Go work construction. So something like that. I didn't want to write a poem saying my mom doesn't believe in me like I was 5 years old. You know what I mean? So what I did was I created a character, the fire eater, who gets abandoned by his circus family and has to go on the street and perform on Hollywood Boulevard in order to survive. And so instead of being direct with that poem, which I thought might come out sappy at this age, even though Mexican males are always striving for their mother's approval, instead I went with the metaphor of the fire eater. So I think it varies and in my experience.
So I just want to respond. I think there's some element of genre again in here, like the family poem, because you're talking about family poems, that we've all read thousands of family poems, and those family, and we also all have our experience, and somehow we're writing a family poem because we've read so many, but we're bringing our experience to it. But then we're also being shaped by the experience of the family poem. So everybody's read these poems like Philip Levine, Otto Limon. You could, back to Stanley Kunitz's early father poem. So it's become a kind of thing. So there's this give and take between what we're saying and what the form is saying. That so each person is bringing a shape to that kind of genre. But the genre is also shaping that experience. There's sort of there's a symbiosis between the two things. So it's not I feel like it's not just we don't sit down to just, it's interesting. We sit down to say, I want to write about my experience, but the first thing you think about to write about your experience is a way of writing something that you've, as Dzvinia said, some voices that you've heard. Well, these voices are coming out of ways of speaking, and those ways of speaking are coming to you, and then you're making a way of speaking through those. So, it's not just it's not, it's not a single thing here. It's both of them are more things together to form that one piece, I think. So if there hadn't been hundreds of family poems were not necessarily a genre before, what was it, the 50s or the 60s? Like, you didn't go back and see hundreds of family poems written by, Eliot or Whitman or others. It just somewhere around the late 50s or something that started writing about yourself, and the personal became a thing. That and so many immigrant groups, and so many, like the Jews, everybody, and the Ukrainians, I guess the Mexicans, everybody has brought something to that kind of poem, their own experience. Okay, enough said, Jeff. No, just kidding.
No, and the panel is not set up to talk about cultures, and yet we've put together what I think I couldn't have planned a better cultural panel. Than what we ended up with here, just because we have a common poetic background, and that pulls us together across cultures in a way that I couldn't have planned. The serendipity of it, amazes me. When we look back on what we've just accomplished. Other thoughts before we wrap up here? Things that maybe your colleagues have brought to the forefront.
I really wanted to mention something, because I was listening to Jose saying about me, the fire eater. It is such a gorgeous poem, and the whole premise of it I absolutely love. And then there's when you're talking about it and you said, well, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm 5 years old or whatever. And I think that there's a freedom. I wonder when you actually sit down and you start a poem, I don't want to sound like I'm 5 years old, but so you're actually saying exactly what you're feeling. And I don't mean to bring this up, but it's been sitting here. There's a collection, The Sun at Night, poems by Brooks Haxton, that had a poem called The Black Raincoat. And it's about him having this fetish about this black raincoat. And what I loved about it and thought was unique was how directly, and I'm just going to super quickly read the opening lines. He says, I don't know. I wanted to bring the raincoat maybe for the weather if it changed. You got me. It was odd the way I laid it out and smoothed and buttoned it. I folded the arms down forward in a V. This was my wife's coat, okay? Like he's got that defense of like, what? You know, like he interrupts the poem, like, this is my wife's coat. So she's like, fuck off, you know, like, let me finish my poem, you know? So he's already interjecting all these insecurities, but he's at least in that poem attacking them first on. And sometimes I think like, God, if I wrote a book that just started and ended me talking without shaping anything, probably be incredibly boring, but it is a tempting thing for me with a glass of wine to try. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Well, I just would recommend the book since Dzvinia. I'm not going to read from it because, but I think an interesting book that removes itself from personal experience, and I think that everyone would like is it's kind of considered a classic, Augusto Monterroso's The Black Sheep and Other Fables, which is a wonderful book. And so all these fables he's able to comment on politically. He obviously gets himself in the vision of the poem, but in the vision of the prose poem or the fable, but you know, you don't hear a thing about where he lives or any of that, but yet it seems very current. It was written, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 years ago. He also has apparently one of the shortest short stories, and it goes something like, I think it goes, when I woke up in the morning, the dinosaur was still there.
Yeah.
So anyway, that I'll leave it with that.
Okay. Any other last words before
Jose?
we wind up?
No, I think that for me, prose poetry, at least initially when I started, it was about freedom. It was about escape. You know, one time I was talking to someone who was incarcerated and talking how they needed to read more politically aware, socially conscious, you know, rebellious literature. And they said, that's fine and everything, but I like science fiction. And I said, why do you like science fiction? They said, because it's an escape, you know? And that's what I think surreal prose poetry, absurdist prose poetry, for me, it was like an escape, a way to, yes, those things were still present, but they were sort of, you know, underneath the skin and less on the surface. And you know, it was a way to sort of just escape all the propaganda and the agendas of literature and just sort of be free yeah, so there was just a lot of sense of freedom involved in that. And then my linear verse was more like, okay, my reality, which is inescapable and equally as important. And I found sort of similarities with the African-American poet, Black poet, Amiri Baraka. And for a while, I felt like I only could relate to him in terms of wanting to be part of the avant-garde, and then at the same time, keeping it real with your people, and those sort of that battle and struggle. And so, yeah, that's why all three of my full-length collections are split between the first half being the linear verse about my real life, and then the second half, surrealist, absurdist poetry with you know, Mexican American imagery as well.
Wow.
Yeah. Excellent. And so we already knew this, but we have reaffirmed how that we as writers have multiple identities. And thank you again for sharing your identities, various windows into your lives and windows out of your lives through your poems. Winding up for today, thank you, Jeff Friedman, Jose Hernandez, Diaz, and Dzvinia Orlowsky for joining us today. For Pier-Glass Poetry Panels, I'm Stan Galloway. We'll see you next time. Have a good day.